On the 8th of September, 1941, German panzers sealed the ring around Leningrad, trapping 3 million civilians and 500,000 troops behind enemy lines. Soviet commanders stared at their maps and saw salvation in the unpaved southern corridors through Sinyavino, Tikhvin, and Lyuban, the same mud roads that had moved 2 million men just months before. Those routes would consume 90,000 men at Lyuban alone, over 100,000 at Nevsky Piatachok, and achieve near zero supply delivery across 872 days of siege. The route that actually saved the city was 30 kilometers of 10-centimeter ice that sank over 1,000 trucks, evacuated 1.3 million people, and delivered 1.6 million tons of cargo, with a vehicle loss rate the mud offensives could only dream of. This is how terrain, physics, and a frozen lake determined which supply routes worked and which ones became mass graves. The so-called mud roads weren't a single route. They were a network of unpaved corridors stretching 100 to 200 kilometers south and east of Leningrad, threading through swamps and forests toward the towns of Muga, Sinyavino, Tikhvin, and Lyuban. Soviet commanders looked at these paths in the summer of 1941 and saw lifelines. They'd watched 2 million troops mobilize along these approaches in June and July, forming defensive lines that halted the German advance 100 kilometers south at the Luga River on the 19th through 23rd of July. If armies could march on these roads, supply convoys could follow. The problem was a Russian word, Rasputitsa, the mud season. Autumn rains and spring thaws turned unpaved roads into liquid earth that swallowed trucks up to their axles. But in late summer 1941, when 300,000 refugees flooded into Leningrad along these same routes, fleeing the German advance through Pskov and Novgorod, nobody was thinking about October weather. The mud roads looked viable because they'd worked before. What Soviet planners didn't grasp yet was that working in retreat and working under siege were two different problems. When General Georgy Zhukov arrived in Leningrad on the 10th of September, freshly appointed by Stalin to break the encirclement, his first instinct was to attack south, recapture the mud routes, force open the corridor to Moscow. The lake? That was a backup plan, a desperate gamble for when everything else failed. Everything else was already failing. On the 29th of August, German forces captured Muga, severing Leningrad's last southern rail link. Hitler's Directive No. 34, issued on the 21st of August, had been explicit: encircle Leningrad in conjunction with the Finns, targeting all land corridors. The directive worked. Between the 2nd and 9th of September, Finnish forces captured the northern salients at Belustrov and Kiryasalo, blocking escape routes across the Karelian Isthmus. They stopped precisely at their pre-Winter War border, refusing to advance further. That decision would matter later. For now, it just meant the noose was complete. Every mud road south of Leningrad, every swampy track through Sinyavino, every forest path toward Tikhvin now sat behind German lines. The Wehrmacht controlled the terrain. The Luftwaffe controlled the sky above it. And in mid-October, the Germans decided to go deeper. On the 16th of October 1941, Wehrmacht forces launched an offensive toward Tikhvin, a rail junction 200 kilometers east of Leningrad, 110 miles. The town sat on the last functioning connection between Moscow and Lake Ladoga's eastern shore. If Tikhvin fell and stayed fallen, there would be no resupply route at all. Not mud, not ice, not anything. The German advance moved fast through terrain that should have stopped them. Swamps froze early that year. By the 8th of November, German infantry entered Tikhvin and pushed to the Volkhov River beyond it. This was the deepest penetration of the entire Leningrad operation. The Wehrmacht now sat astride the final link in the chain. Soviet commanders in Leningrad could hear the clock ticking. General Kirill Meretskov, commanding the Volkhov front, assembled what forces he could scrape together and counterattacked on the 5th of December. The fight for Tikhvin lasted 5 days. House to house, trench to trench. When the smoke cleared on the 10th of December, the Soviets had retaken the town. The rail line was saved, the eastern mud route partially restored. Except it didn't matter, because the Germans still held Sinyavino, the bottleneck between Leningrad and Ladoga. The mud roads were still cut. All Tikhvin's recapture meant was that supplies could now reach the eastern shore of the lake. They still couldn't reach the city. While Meretskov was fighting for Tikhvin, a different kind of soldier was fighting a different kind of battle. In early November, Soviet hydrographers ventured onto the surface of Lake Ladoga with measuring tools and prayers. The ice was 10 centimeters thick, 4 inches, barely enough to support a man on foot, let alone a truck carrying 2 tons of flour. But the alternative was watching Leningrad starve. On the 17th of November, the 88th Separate Bridge Construction Battalion marked a route 30 kilometers east across the ice, planting landmarks. German artillery had the range. Luftwaffe bombers had the coordinates. Many of the engineers died setting those markers. 3 days later, on the 20th of November, the first convoy of ZIS-5 trucks rolled onto the ice. 30 to 50 kilometers across open water, frozen just solid enough to bear weight. Temperatures hit minus 40 Celsius. The ice creaked and groaned under the wheels. Drivers kept their doors open, ready to jump if the surface gave way. 10 to 20% of the vehicles were lost during the operation. Some broke through the ice and sank. Some took direct hits from German bombs. Some simply vanished in blizzards and were found weeks later, frozen solid with their cargo still strapped down. But the convoys kept moving, because on that same day, the 20th of November 1941, Leningrad's bread ration hit its lowest point. 125 grams per day for children and white-collar workers. Less than 1 slice. 250 grams for manual laborers. The road of life wasn't a supply route. It was a race against mass death. The math was simple and horrifying. Leningrad held 3 million people. At 125 grams of bread per day, the city was consuming its reserves faster than any mud road could replenish them, even if the mud roads had been open, which they weren't. The road of life, in those first weeks, brought in just enough to slow the dying, not stop it. Between September 1941 and April 1942, somewhere between 800,000 and 1.1 million civilians died. Mostly starvation, mostly cold. The Soviet government recorded over 2,000 cases of cannibalism during that winter. Those records stayed classified until the 1980s. Families ate sawdust bread mixed with cellulose. They boiled leather belts for soup. They burned furniture for heat, and then burned the floorboards, and then burned books. And every day, the Road of Life trucks crawled across the ice, bringing 300 tons when the city needed 3,000. The drivers knew the arithmetic. They could see it in the faces of the people they evacuated on the return trip. Hollow eyes, skeletal frames, children who weighed less than the sacks of flour in the truck beds. The Road of Life wasn't delivering enough food to save everyone. It was delivering just enough to keep the city alive long enough for someone to reopen the mud roads. Someone tried. On the 7th of January, 1942, the Soviet Lyuban offensive operation kicked off with the objective every commander in Leningrad had been screaming for since September: break through the southern mud routes and link up with the main Soviet lines. The plan committed the Second Shock Army, 90,000 men, to a 16-week push through the swamps and forests around Lyuban, a town 50 kilometers south of the encirclement line. The offensive launched in the dead of winter, which meant the mud was frozen, which should have helped. It didn't. German air superiority meant every Soviet supply column took casualties. The swamps, even frozen, channeled movement into narrow corridors that German machine guns could cover with interlocking fire. The Second Shock Army advanced, took ground, and then found itself surrounded. By April, the pocket was sealed. 90,000 men encircled. No resupply. No reinforcement. No escape. The Germans methodically destroyed the trapped force over the next month. Fewer than 10,000 men made it out. A 90% casualty rate. For context, during that same period, January through July 1942, the Road of Life evacuated hundreds of thousands of civilians across the ice and by barge with a vehicle loss rate of 10 to 20%. One route was a lifeline. The other was a meat grinder. But Soviet commanders kept feeding men into the grinder because the mud roads were supposed to work. They were on the maps. They connected Leningrad to the Soviet rear. They just happened to be controlled by an enemy who'd spent 6 months fortifying every square meter. The Neva River runs west out of Lake Ladoga, cutting through the southern approaches to Leningrad before emptying into the Gulf of Finland. In 1942 through early 1943, Soviet forces clung to a tiny bridgehead on the southern bank called Nevsky Pятачок, the Neva Patch, a few hundred meters of frozen mud that cost over 100,000 casualties cumulatively to contest. The objective was the same as Lyuban: secure a foothold, expand it, and open a southern mud route into the city. The fighting lasted from September 1942 through early 1943. Artillery duels at ranges so close that gunners could see the faces of the men they were killing. Infantry charges across ice that offered zero cover. Flamethrower teams burning out bunkers at point-blank range. When the offensive finally sputtered out, the Soviets held a slightly larger bridgehead. No breakthrough, no mud route, no land link to Leningrad. Just another 100,000 dead for a piece of ground you could walk across in 5 minutes. The Germans, for their part, lost just as many men defending it. Both sides understood what the Neva Patch represented. Whoever controlled the southern bank controlled the mud routes. Whoever controlled the mud routes controlled Leningrad's survival. Except by early 1943, survival wasn't coming from the south anymore. It was coming from the lake. The Road of Life operated across 2 winters, 1941 to 42 and 1942 to 43, plus summer barge traffic in between. The numbers tell the story. 1,000 trucks in the fleet, mostly ZIS-5s fitted with tire chains for ice traction. 360,000 tons of supplies delivered in the first winter alone. 1.6 million tons total across the siege. Over 1.3 million people evacuated, most of them in the first winter, when starvation was killing 10,000 a day. The convoys ran 24 hours. Trucks spaced 50 meters apart to distribute weight across the ice. Anti-aircraft guns mounted on sleds to escort them. Repair teams stationed every 5 kilometers to patch vehicles or pull them out of ice holes. The Luftwaffe bombed the route daily. German artillery shelled it from Schlüsselburg. The ice itself was a minefield of weak spots and pressure ridges. Drivers navigated by landmarks, wooden posts hammered into the ice by the same engineers who died planting them in November. 20% of the drivers were women, a fact the Soviet propaganda machine downplayed because it complicated the hero narrative. Over 1,000 vehicles sank into Lake Ladoga during the operation. Their wrecks are still down there. Divers visit them now, pulling up rusted truck frames and frozen cargo. The Road of Life wasn't elegant. It wasn't safe. It was just the only thing that worked when everything else had failed. And in January 1943, the Soviets finally opened a land route that didn't immediately collapse. Operation Iskra, the Spark, launched on the 12th of January 1943, with 300,000 Soviet troops, 5,000 guns, and 500 tanks concentrated on a narrow front at Sinyavino Heights. The objective was surgical: punch through the German lines along the Ladoga coast and link up with the Volkhov front attacking from the east. Open a land corridor, any corridor. The Germans defending Sinyavino numbered 200,000, dug into fortifications they'd spent 16 months perfecting. The battle lasted 18 days. Soviet artillery fired preparatory barrages that turned the frozen ground into a moonscape. Tank columns pushed through minefields, losing a third of their vehicles in the first hour. Infantry followed, taking casualties that would have broken armies in other wars. By the 30th of January, the two Soviet fronts met. The land blockade was broken. The corridor they'd opened was 8 to 10 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, running along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. German artillery could still hit it from Sinyavino Heights to the south. Every supply train that used the route ran under fire. But it was a route. Soviet engineers built a rail spur through the corridor within weeks. The first train reached Leningrad in February, carrying supplies that didn't have to cross the ice. The Germans lost over 13,000 men defending Sinyavino. The Soviets lost more, though exact numbers were never released. What mattered was the corridor existed. For the first time since September 1941, Leningrad had a stable ground connection to the Soviet rear. But stable didn't mean secure, and it definitely didn't mean the mud roads were viable again. On the 10th of February 1943, less than 2 weeks after Iskra opened the corridor, Soviet forces launched Operation Polar Star. The objective was to expand the Sinyavino corridor, push the Germans back from the mud routes south of Leningrad, and finally break the siege completely. The operation committed multiple armies across a front stretching from Lake Ilmen to the Gulf of Finland. It failed. German defenses held. Soviet casualties mounted. By the 1st of April, the offensive was called off with nothing to show but another round of losses. The narrow Iskra corridor remained the only land link, still under artillery fire, still vulnerable. The mud roads south of the city stayed in German hands, which meant the road of life kept running. Even with a land corridor open, the lake route delivered more tonnage and evacuated more civilians than the rail spur could handle. The ice road operated through the winter of 1942 to 43, as if Iskra had never happened, because in practical terms, it hadn't changed the fundamental problem. The Germans still controlled the terrain. The mud still swallowed any attempt to move supply columns at scale. And the siege, technically lifted in January 1943, continued for another year. Strip away the narratives and look at the numbers. The road of life covered 30 to 50 kilometers across Lake Ladoga. The mud roads stretched 100 to 200 kilometers through swamps and forests. The road delivered 1.6 million tons of supplies between 1941 and 1943. The mud roads delivered near zero after September 1941, with only partial restoration after Tikhvin's recapture and Iskra's corridor. The road evacuated over 1.3 million civilians. The mud roads evacuated refugees before the encirclement closed. The road lost 10 to 20% of its vehicles to ice breaks and bombing. The mud road offensives suffered catastrophic casualties, as seen at Lyuban and Nevsky Piatachok. The road operated reliably every winter from 1941 to 1943. Attempts to reopen the mud roads achieved only partial success with Iskra's corridor in January 1943, with full breakthrough not coming until January 1944. The comparison isn't close. One route saved the city. The other consumed armies trying to reach it. The question isn't which route worked. The question is why the mud roads failed so catastrophically when they looked so promising on paper. Rasputitsa hit twice a year. Autumn rains from September through November. Spring thaws from March through May. The unpaved roads south and east of Leningrad turned into rivers of mud during both seasons. Trucks didn't drive through Rasputitsa. They sank. Entire convoys disappeared into the muck. Vehicles abandoned where they stopped moving. The Germans knew this. They timed their Tikhvin offensive for mid-October, after the autumn rains started, because they knew Soviet counterattacks would bog down. Literally. The mud was a defensive weapon. But mud alone doesn't explain why the Soviets lost 90,000 men at Lyuban or suffered massive casualties at Nevsky Piatachok. German air superiority does. The Luftwaffe dominated the southern approaches throughout the siege. Every Soviet supply column, every troop movement, every attempt to concentrate forces for an offensive got spotted from the air and bombed. The Road of Life, by contrast, had Soviet anti-aircraft coverage. Fighters flying out of Leningrad could reach the lake. They couldn't reach Lyuban. Geography compounded the problem. The southern mud routes crossed multiple rivers and swamp systems. Each one was a choke point. Each one had to be bridged under fire. The lake was flat, frozen, direct, no rivers to cross, no swamps to navigate, just 30 to 50 kilometers of ice that got harder as winter deepened. And then there's the factor nobody talks about, the Finns. When Finnish forces stopped at the pre-Winter War border in September 1941, they left the northern shore of Lake Ladoga uncontested. Soviet convoys could use the entire lake without worrying about attacks from the north. If the Finns had pushed south, the Road of Life wouldn't have existed. The mud roads failed because they were long, exposed, impassable half the year, and controlled by an enemy with air superiority. The Road of Life succeeded because it was short, defensible, frozen solid in winter, and flanked by a neutral power that chose not to interfere. On the 14th of January 1944, Soviet forces launched coordinated offensives across the entire Leningrad Oblast. This wasn't another attempt to nibble at the edges. This was the full push, multiple fronts, overwhelming force. The objective was to drive the Germans 60 to 100 kilometers back from the city and reopen the Moscow-Leningrad Railway through a land corridor wide enough to be defensible. The offensive achieved both goals. German Army Group North, weakened by years of attrition and the transfer of divisions to other fronts, couldn't hold. They retreated in fighting withdrawals, contesting every kilometer, but unable to stop the advance. By the 27th of January, 1944, the siege was over, 872 days after it began. The Moscow-Leningrad Railway reopened via the expanded land corridor. The mud roads, or what was left of them, became viable. Again, now that Soviet forces controlled both sides. Summer barge routes across Lake Ladoga resumed without interference. The Road of Life was decommissioned. The trucks were reassigned. The ice route that had saved the city was no longer needed because the land routes finally worked the way Soviet planners had always assumed they would. It just took 2.5 years and 1 million dead to make it happen. The butcher's bill for the siege of Leningrad runs to numbers so large they stop meaning anything. 800,000 to 1.1 million civilian deaths. Most from starvation, most in the first winter. Soviet military casualties around 1 million across the entire siege. German casualties around 300,000. The siege tied up 700,000 German troops in Army Group North, forces that could have reinforced Stalingrad or Kursk or the defense of Ukraine. It preserved the Baltic Fleet, which remained a threat in being throughout the war. It kept Leningrad's industrial capacity intact, factories that produced tanks and artillery even under bombardment. And it demonstrated that a city could survive encirclement if it had one functioning supply line, no matter how tenuous. The Road of Life enabled that survival. The mud road offensives cost massive casualties in failed attempts to do what the lake route accomplished with truck convoys and civilian drivers. Lyuban alone consumed 90,000 men. Nevsky Piatachok suffered over 100,000 casualties cumulatively. Sinyavino, Tikhvin, Polar Star, all added to the count. Every offensive launched to reopen the southern approaches achieved only partial success with Iskra's corridor until the final push in January 1944, when the Germans were too weak to hold. The strategic consequence was simple. The siege failed. Hitler wanted Leningrad erased. The city survived. That survival came at a cost, measured in mass graves and frozen lakes. But it came. And it came. Because Soviet logistics, for once, outperformed Soviet tactics. The Road of Life Museum sits on the shore of Lake Ladoga at 60 degrees north, 31 degrees east. The building displays photographs of the convoys, maps of the route, artifacts pulled from the lake. Outside, a ZIS-5 truck sits on a pedestal, restored to the configuration it would have had in 1941. Tire chains, open cab, wooden cargo bed. Visitors take photos next to it without understanding what it took to drive that thing across 40 kilometers of ice under bomber attack. The wrecks of over 1,000 vehicles rest on the lake bottom, depth depending on where they sank. Dive tourism companies run trips to the sites now. You can see the trucks down there, frozen in time, cargo still strapped down in some cases. Piskarevskoye Cemetery holds the remains of 500,000 siege victims. Mass burials. Unmarked plots. A memorial wall lists the years. 1941, 1942, 1943. The Sinyavino Heights have their own memorials, smaller, less visited. Plaques marking where the Second Shock Army died, where Nevsky Piatachok consumed over 100,000 men for a bridgehead, where Operation Iskra finally broke through. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst teach the siege of Leningrad as a logistics case study. The lesson isn't about tactics or strategy. It's about supply lines. No Ladoga route, no victory. That's the takeaway. A debate continues among historians about when the siege was truly lifted. January 1943, when Iskra opened the corridor. Or January 1944, when the Germans were pushed back entirely. The answer depends on definitions. The blockade was broken in 43. The siege ended in 44. Both are true. Films have been made, books written. Video games model the mud mechanics and the ice road logistics. Every year, reenactors drive period trucks across Lake Ladoga in winter, retracing the route. They do it in peacetime, without bombs, and still call it the hardest thing they've ever done. On the 8th of September, 1941, German panzers closed the ring around Leningrad, and every Soviet commander looked at the mud roads south and east and saw the solution. Recapture Munga, push through Sinyavino, take back Tikhvin, open the corridors. It made sense. Those were the routes armies had used for centuries. They were on the maps. They connected the city to Moscow. The problem was the maps didn't show the mud. They didn't account for Rasputitsa turning roads into swamps. They didn't mark the German artillery positions, or the Luftwaffe bases, or the swamp systems that channeled every attack into kill zones. The mud roads consumed massive casualties in failed offensives before Soviet forces finally broke through in January 1944. The Road of Life saved over 1.3 million civilians and delivered 1.6 million tons of supplies with a loss rate far lower than what the mud offensives suffered. One route was a gamble that paid off. The other was a certainty that killed everyone who tried it. The difference wasn't courage. Soviet soldiers showed equal bravery on the ice and in the swamps. The difference was terrain, physics, the simple fact that frozen water is harder than liquid mud. Leningrad survived because a few engineers walked out onto 10-centimeter ice in November 1941 and decided it would hold. And because 1,000 truck drivers kept crossing that ice, even after watching their friends break through and drown. The mud roads were supposed to save the city. The ice road did. That's the story. One impossible route that worked, and one obvious route that didn't. 872 days of starvation, bombardment, and death ended not by breaking the enemy's lines, but by driving trucks across a frozen lake until the enemy was too weak to matter. The trap that closed on the 8th of September, 1941, stayed closed until the 27th of January, 1944. But inside that trap, 3 million people survived winter after winter because someone built a road where no road should exist. That's how Leningrad lived. Not through the mud, through the ice.